Here we are. Right. Right, well, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Tim Buckley. Tim is Director of Climate Energy Finance Studies, Australasia. Some of you might have read the article he wrote for the Sydney Morning Herald that appeared in yesterday's paper, entitled "It's Time for Fossil Fuel Profiteers to Pay Their Way," a sentiment I'm sure is very close to many of our hearts. You might also have seen the interview he did for the West Report in June, entitled "The Power Bill We Can't Afford." Finally, those of you who've been around for a while will remember that he's addressed us twice in the past, covering the economics of fossil fuels and renewables. So tonight he's going to update us on the transition from fossil fuels to renewables. If you've got any questions for Tim, can you put them in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So over to you, Tim.
Excellent. Good evening, and thanks Ken and Billy for hosting tonight. I'll just share my screen, and right. If I could also start by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects. I'm going to just talk, as Ken mentioned, about the global energy transition, a couple of data points there, and then pivot back into the domestic work that we're seeing in the last month or so from the federal government. And it's wonderful to be able to talk about positive energy transition trends in the Australian market, thanks to the Albanese government. So I'll finish on that aspect. But what I thought I might just do, talk initially about the global side. I'll touch on China and their growing lead in this technology transition. And then I'll highlight a couple of financial trends, and then, as mentioned, Australia.
What impact?
So 5 key reasons why the energy transition is accelerating, why it's inevitable, and to give you some positive aspects. Firstly, technology-driven deflation. So we're in the middle of massive fossil fuel hyperinflation at the moment. So everything to do with fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, prices going through the roof, and not up 5 or 10%, but up 5 or 10-fold in the last 2 years. So I think it's worth bearing in mind, solar prices have actually gone up a little bit in the last 6 months, or last 12 months, but up might be 10, 20, 30, 40, 50%, not 500% the way coal and gas have. So it's worth bearing in mind, if anything, the relative competitive advantage of the deflationary trend in renewables is accelerated even in 2022. So there is a silver lining. This is technology driven, it is inevitable, and the economies of scale just get bigger and bigger every year. The second driver is global policy developments. I almost would have removed this slide if it wasn't for what we just saw with President Biden in America in the last week. The Inflation Reduction Act got passed, and that means America now has a chance to deliver on the climate ambitions that President Biden started so strongly on and then fell very flat. But now all of a sudden, a quarter or a third of $1 trillion of capital being directed towards building up American ingenuity and manufacturing capacity in deflation. So global policy imperatives, we've got Japan and Korea both committed to net zero emissions by 2050. China, peak emissions before 2030. I'll come back to China because I'm actually a China bull when it comes to energy transition. And India, a market I follow very closely, just deliberately said, well, if China's going to go 10 years after the West, then India will go 10 years after China. But the reality is the opportunities for both China and India to go faster is very, very clear. Now, I'll come back to Australia. So the third factor of why I am bullish on energy transition is the pricing of carbon emissions. Now, in Australia, the idea of a carbon price has been toxic, but again, I'll come back to Australia. In Europe, what we have seen is a progressive building of momentum in pricing in carbon emissions. Only 2 days ago, the EU ETS, the European Emissions Trading Scheme price, got to 99 euros. So within 1% of 100 euros. Now, it was only 2 or 3 years ago, it was a fifth of that price. So the idea in Europe that you price in the externality and then markets can respond is proven and driving and working well. It's also worth bearing in mind, again, a lot of the Australian press attacks China. We take way too American perspective on that, in my view. China, a year ago, launched what is now the largest emissions trading scheme in the world. It's 4 times bigger than the European one, where Europe's phenomenally successful. So China, it's more ancillary than it is central to policy in climate decarbonisation in Europe, but it is building in China. And there is discussion about China expanding their already enormous ETS outside of the power sector to encompass 8 of the biggest emitter sectors in the country. So that'll probably happen now next year rather than this year. But worth bearing in mind when people again constantly point out China is building new coal-fired power plants. China is also leading the world on decarbonisation, and unlike Australia, unlike America, it has a national emissions trading scheme. The next reason to be positive is the Glasgow Finance Net Zero Emissions Pledge. Sorry, I got that one wrong. Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero has $130 trillion of capital pledged to 1.5 degrees, to lending, investing and insuring in alignment with 1.5 degrees. Now, it's almost impossible for us as a world to deliver on 1.5 degrees, yet $130 trillion of global capital has pledged to align their investment practices with that outcome. Now, at some point, they have to move from talking the talk to walking the walk. We are seeing some positive trends on that front, but at the end of the day, a lot of it is momentum that is building, and I am pretty positive that the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero Emissions will play a critical role if we are to deliver on the Paris Agreement. And ultimately, we can't ignore the climate science. I think everyone on this call would understand it. I mean, this is a picture of a heat map in India 3 months ago. In the middle of spring, central India was seeing temperatures of 50 degrees. That was spring, not summer. And so my colleagues in Delhi were having to deal with 50-degree temperatures. It's just unsustainable already. We don't need the climate to get worse, but invariably it will get worse even if we act at the speed the scientists are telling us we have to. So the reality is there's a climate emergency, and every year of delay will just make it worse. And that will mean rather than a planned transition, we'll have a chaotic transition, but we will have to have a transition because the science is inevitable. Finance does acknowledge climate risk, and it's just a chart from Swiss Re, one of the biggest insurers in the world, just highlighting the documented evidence to say global insured natural catastrophe losses are rising virtually every year, and they are very much aware in the insurance sector of it. They've got the better data than anyone else in the world. We probably need to actually work with the data. This is a chart from the IEA, and I just really wanted to highlight here a point which, again, when I talk about the role of finance, finance will play a key role for us to solve the climate emergency because the amount of money required is huge. The world every year spends $2.4 trillion on energy, whether that's upfront investment or fossil fuel commodities that are burnt in power plants or in our cars. So $2.4 trillion a year, that number is going to grow dramatically as the developing world catches up and gets a standard of living more similar to the developed world. And it will also accelerate because unlike a coal-fired power plant, when you have to spend a whole lot of money building the coal plant, but then every year you have to buy more coal to fuel the coal plant. When you build a wind or a solar project, you pay 100% of the capital up front, and then you have a zero operating cost for the next 25 years. So there is a pull forward as you decarbonize. So the IEA, the International Energy Agency, talks about how investments in energy globally are likely to hit $4 trillion a year for us to deliver on decarbonisation. That is $100 trillion cumulative investment by 2050. Now, I mention that because banks, insurers, and asset managers are all about investing, and they're all about getting fees on the back of those investments. $100 trillion opportunity. It's the biggest investment boom that we're going to see in any sector in the world in the next 3 decades. This is just looking at Bloomberg New Energy Finance's tracking of quarterly investment in renewable energy. It is up 11% year on year. So the trend is nowhere near fast enough, but it is building with each year. So there is a positive trajectory. We need to see it accelerate. And again, this is just another way of looking at it. This is the International Energy Agency flagging that we need to see annual investment in the energy sector rise to about $4.5 trillion a year. $4.5 trillion a year for us to deliver on a 1.5 to 2 degree outcome. And the chart on the right shows how that will therefore erode the need for fossil fuels quite dramatically, like by 50% over the next decade, if we're to deliver on a 1.5 degree world. So we do need a massive shift in the global energy system. You can't do that overnight. And when you have shortages, when you have out of left field events like Putin's invasion of Ukraine, you get enormous global ramifications from this sector. Again, sorry to hit you with so many charts, but this chart, I just wanted to, again, point out something which most people wouldn't be aware of. So this is, again, the IEA data showing, if you look at the fourth last group of chart bars on the chart, solar PV, the world's investing $250 billion a year in solar. That is actually 3 or 4 times what the coal power sector is actually investing every year. Wind is 3 times as big as coal, 3 times as big as gas, 3 times as big as nuclear. So solar is not a cottage industry. It's actually 3 times bigger than the coal power sector. So I just thought I'd make that observation to you that wind and solar are seeing enormous investments. We do want to see them double again. So it is a huge investment opportunity. I come at things from a finance perspective. I look at the flow of monies. There's a fair flow of money. I think people underestimate what's already the size of the industry already. And again, last IEA chart, but the group of 4 bars on the left is all advanced economies put together. The group of bars on the right is China. And so my point is China leads the world. China invests more in renewables. So RPG, according to the IEA, renewable power generation. China invests as much in renewable energy generation in 2020, 2022 as all other developed countries put together. That's, I think, pretty staggering. So all this crap about China being the biggest coal producer in the world, the biggest burner, and they're constantly building new coal-fired power plants, it is true, but they're also by far the biggest investor in all things to do with decarbonisation. They will build 5 to 6 times as much renewable energy as America will this year alone. Like they'll do 150 to 180 gigawatts of renewables. America will hit a record 30 gigawatts this year. So I actually write up and talk pro-China partly to antagonize the Americans because we need them in the race. It's critical that both China and America throw everything they can at solving this problem for us, because you need economies of scale and you need a massive amount of capital and you need American ingenuity. But China leads the world in nuclear, in hydro, in batteries, in electric vehicles, in solar and wind installations, in solar and wind manufacturing, and in green hydrogen. And and in ground heat pumps, something Europe's now talking about very, very seriously. They also lead the world in grid transmission investment. So they literally lead the world in all aspects to do with decarbonisation industries. And they are doing it at a scale that I think the West is underestimating. So all of these figures are public. You would all have heard of Tesla. Last month, BYD became the biggest electric vehicle manufacturer in the world by volume, overtaking Tesla. BYD's EV sales are up 290% year on year in 2022. So it is now bigger than Tesla. Now, most people outside of China haven't heard of BYD other than Warren Buffett, who's a major shareholder in it. But it is now bigger than Tesla. And I say that because its sales are almost all, 90% of them are in China. And China will probably sell over 6 million EVs this year, which is almost 100% growth year on year. They'll be half the world's EV sales this year. So again, China just leads the world in all of these industries of the future. They're doing it for investment, for technology, for employment, for export, and industry dominance, world leadership. And it also happens to help the climate. Skip that one. India, a market I've spent a lot of time working on. India has also made significant progress. And so I throw this in because India is the 4th largest electricity grid in the world. And this is just the data for the last fiscal year, the year to March 2022. And you can see that they built an extra, the column on the right shows the increased net capacity by fuel type in the last 12 months. So India added net 1.4 gigawatts of new coal. They added 15.4 gigawatts of renewable energy in the last 12 months. So 90+% of their new capacity adds in the last 12 months were renewable energy. So the idea that India is blaming the West and just ignoring the problem is just wrong. India is one of the biggest investors in renewable, and they're doing it again for all sorts of strategic national interest reasons, such as energy security. I don't care what the motive is. Energy security is a key driver of every country in the world, and this is a massive driver for Prime Minister Modi and for India to invest in more domestic renewables because it reduces their reliance on imported fossil fuels. Again, whilst the last 6 to 12 months, we've seen a resurgence in fossil fuel companies. We've seen a lot of companies' share prices going up. I just wanted to remind you, I think I used this chart in both of my last 2 presentations in the last 5 years. I'm still using it. NextEra Energy is the biggest investor in renewables in the world, the biggest of any company in the world. It's spending $15 billion this year alone. It has been the biggest investor in renewables in the world for every year for the last decade or 2. And it's the green line. The purple line is the US stock market, and the black line is Exxon. Exxon, obviously, one of the biggest fossil fuel companies in the world, the biggest fossil fuel company in America, and Exxon's shares have massively underperformed the US market, even with a big recovery in the last 18 months as fuel prices, fossil fuel prices have gone through the roof. Even with that catch-up, they have still massively underperformed. So when players like BlackRock, the biggest company in the world with $10 trillion of assets under management, says they accept the science of climate change, they accept it because they know by investing in Exxon, they're losing money for their investors every year over time. Not necessarily in any particular year. This year is the year of hyper fossil fuel inflation. So obviously everything to do with it, with fossil fuels is going up, including the shares of Exxon and Whitehaven and Peabody. But over the long term, you've made a lot more money investing in NextEra Energy than you have in Exxon. Again, fund managers and banks are all motivated by harvesting and managing more and more assets. There's been some huge capital raises over the last couple of months in infrastructure funds, and these are some of the biggest private equity fund managers in the world, whether it's Brookfield, whether it's EQT, whether it's Stonepeak, KKR, BlackRock, and all of them have done some of their biggest fundraising this year in infrastructure, which is all about raising money to invest in wind and solar and electricity grids, which is all about driving capital to decarbonize the energy system. So there is some positive developments in global finance. Pivoting a little bit to Australia, I've spent the last 3, 4, 5 months looking at AGL. One of the big debates over the last decade has been in finance, should I say, and in environmental movements is the idea, do we engage with companies? Do we divest from companies? How do we get companies to change? How do we protect ourselves from stranded assets? Now, with AGL, for the last 6 years, AGL has been one of the biggest laggards in Australia. It's destroyed about $10 billion of shareholder wealth. And courtesy of the man pictured on the left, Graham Hunt, he was chair and now he's CEO of AGL. He's driven the company into the ground. The man on the right, Mike Cannon-Brookes, is trying to rejuvenate AGL, and we've been working alongside Mike Cannon-Brookes' team on the logic that AGL is too important a company for Australia for us to leave in the hands of fossil fuel Luddites. We need AGL to be a core part of the solution. We need AGL to pivot from being a laggard to a leader. So I've done a number of op-eds and reports in this space in the public domain, and at the moment, unfortunately, we still have the Luddites in control of AGL. They've resigned, they haven't exited, and they said they'll do it at some point in the future. It's bizarre that people can resign and then stay in the seats in the most important energy companies in Australia in the middle of an energy crisis and not be held to account. But unfortunately, all the activist shareholders have largely exited the register. And so you're sitting there with a company which isn't, it's a bit divorced from reality at the moment. It's too important a company for us to just let crash and burn. Now, moving finally, I'll just wrap up on a couple of Australian policy changes. I think, like everyone on this call, I presume you're all people here interested in climate. The ALP is a breath of fresh air. We've got the adults back in charge down in Canberra. I will start by saying the 43% emissions cut proposed in the Act passed by the lower house is nowhere near enough. But it's not aligned with the science, but it's a hell of a good start. And at the end of the day, we need a legislated target. We need some ambition, and 43% is a floor, not a ceiling. And I'm hoping the ALP is trying to beat the sensible adults after 9 years of energy climate chaos down in Canberra. And so I would say 43%, if you want to have and by the way, it's 43% from the all-time record high emissions of 2005. If you're talking about any other country, they use a base of 2000 or 1990, which Scott Morrison and the LNP deliberately picked the worst emissions number ever in Australian history in order to say they would do their 26% from 2005. So let's not get too excited. 43% from the worst ever is not comparable with what other countries are doing. But at least we are likely to enter next month with an Act of Parliament and with all of the government agencies forced to consider climate change as a legal requirement. So I'd much rather have that in place than have the ongoing climate wars. Now, having been a little bit bearish on the ALP, I'll just give you 3 slides to say why I think the promise and the actions behind what they're doing looks to be a lot more positive than the 43%. So the first number I'll call out, 82% renewables by 2030. So within the context of a 43% overall country emissions cut, the ALP's policy is, and they were elected with this policy, they might not have talked about it much, but it is world leading, 82% renewables by 2030. If the ALP and the state governments can work together with corporates and we can deliver on an 82% renewable energy in the electricity sector by 2030, that will be a phenomenal outcome. It's certainly not in the bag. It is a huge ambition. At the moment, we're about 33%. And the idea that we're going to get to 82% within 8 years, I'm not sure the grid can actually handle it, but I think the ALP and investors combined with the state governments will give it a pretty good shot. The second one, we saw last week the announcement of the safeguard mechanism consultation process. I think the safeguard mechanism is, again, a really important policy that's actually in place. It's accepted by Australian corporates. They've all committed to net, well, almost all committed publicly to net zero emissions by 2050. And the safeguard mechanism talks about a significant emissions reduction by so it's a 40 million tonne reduction down to 100 million tonnes by 2030 for the top 215 plants emitting in Australia. So the level of ambition is yet to be determined, but they're talking about between 3.5% and 6% annual emissions reductions for the top 215 plants in Australia. So I think the safeguard mechanism will be a key way of getting heavy industry on the path to decarbonisation. And I think the framework's already in place. It's now just about actually tightening it up so it actually has some teeth and works. But that is an important consultation process that's just been opened up. I think the second last slide, you'll be pleased to hear. The second one we saw last week, the Chris Bowen and the Albanese government embracing the idea of electric vehicles and embracing the idea of emissions targets for our transport sector. At the end of the day, we've got the weakest emissions standards in the world for our transport fleet, and it's overdue that we actually tighten that up. So anyway, it was great to see the amount of positive discussion down in Canberra last week, and certainly Chris Bowen has been talking this up as a huge opportunity. So again, if we can decarbonise the electricity sector, if we can decarbonise heavy industry, if we can decarbonise and accelerate EVs, then you do the transport sector. So all of a sudden you've got three of the biggest sectors in Australia moving very aggressively in the right direction. I'll finish by saying I've got a little bit of press of late. I've put out a report looking at the idea of how the federal government can help solve the concurrent fiscal, energy and climate crises that are hitting us right now in 2022. I've put out this paper looking at the idea of a carbon export windfall profits tax, and a whole lot of initiatives, whether it's the diesel fuel rebate being removed for the major miners, whether it's reform of the PRRT, whether it's making multinational corporations working in Australia using public assets for private tax haven gains. Those sort of corporates should be paying some tax. And so it was great to see Jim Chalmers, the Federal Treasurer, 2 weeks ago announced a accelerated consultation into getting multinational corporates in Australia to actually pay some tax. And an example of that, Exxon in the last 7 years in Australia has booked $71 billion of revenue, and yet they've paid not 1 cent of corporate tax in Australia. That's obscene. It's an abuse of Australia's goodwill, and Jim Chalmers needs to raise tax revenues from somewhere. They're saying they won't introduce new taxes, but they can make the taxes we've got work. And the idea that multinationals can operate in Australia and not pay any tax is certainly not anywhere remotely fair. So I think Jim Chalmers is pretty clear on that. The other aspect of the report that I highlighted was the brilliant move by Queensland Treasurer Cameron Dick 3 months ago. He introduced a really, really progressive coal export royalty program. So royalties, onshore royalties are a state domain, offshore royalties are a federal domain. So it was brilliant to see Queensland move to a progressive coal royalty system. It would be great if New South Wales did the same thing. The revenue foregone this year could well be $20 billion for New South Wales alone. So it's a criminally big number. We should be pushing. We've got the New South Wales state election coming up in March. It shouldn't be a political issue. At the end of the day, We have a budget deficit of about $11 billion a year in New South Wales. We could pay off 100% of the deficit with a progressive royalty system that the Queensland government actually just introduced. We have a flat 7 to 8% royalty in New South Wales. This is a massive opportunity. I would be hoping both the LNP and the ALP state government take this to the election next year, but I'd much rather we did it now while windfall gains are being made. So I know I've covered a lot of ground. Hopefully that made some sense, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions.
Oh, thanks, Tim. That was mind-boggling. People have obviously been concentrating so closely on what you were saying that now got one question in the chat, but we've got a lot of questions that have been pre-submitted. I think I'll hand over to Billy, who can pose the questions, but perhaps another way to do it would be for people to simply put their hand up on the Zoom. Raise your hand if you've got a question. So, Billy, would you like to start the questions off? You there, Billy?
Billy, you're on mute.
How did that happen? Sorry. Look, let's just start with the first question then. Mavis, would you like to ask that question, or would you like me to do it? Where is she?
Yeah, I'm here.
Do you want to ask the question?
Yeah, I'm very concerned about that China is supplying the whole world with solar panels, and how we're all being held at ransom if they decide to stop either supplying Australia's or anybody else's. And I'm really wondering how we can persuade people with big money to really get into the development of our own solar panels, and also, of course, into the transmission towers that are also needed incredibly soon.
Thanks, Mavis. I'll probably give a slightly different answer than what you're expecting. I would probably recommend Australia not go into solar manufacturing. And I've actually given the same advice to the Indian government. They totally ignored me, and they've probably proven to be right in doing so. But the reason being, China actually massively subsidizes their exports of solar modules. They don't make any money on them most of the time. They're doing it for industry development, for technology, and because they are actually the biggest buyer of solar modules in the world. So they want the economies of scale, they want the manufacturing efficiencies, and they want the technology gains to drive the cost of solar modules down every year, which they've done phenomenally successfully over the last decade in order to drive the cost of solar electricity down so that they can install more solar than any other country in the world, which is what they are doing right now. In fact, more than every other country combined is China. No, I am a China bull. But having said that, the reason why Prime Minister Modi was probably right in hindsight, he whacked a 40% solar module import tariff on Chinese product, mainly because there was a border clash and 20 Indian soldiers were killed, and all of a sudden India went nationalist against the Chinese and said, no, we're just going to not be dependent for the reasons you articulated. Now, the reason why I would argue it's really dangerous competing with the Chinese, they do things at a scale that Australia never can, and even India can't compete with. So let me give you an example. China at the moment is building an integrated solar module manufacturing facility which will produce 60 gigawatts per annum of modules. Now, 60 gigawatts, it's integrated manufacturing facility. It's one plant. And it's going to be 15 times bigger than the biggest solar module manufacturing facility in India. Now, the Indian solar market's going to be 5 times bigger than Australia. So the idea, at the end of the day, economies of scale are critical. And China has such a technology lead and a scale lead and a non-profit orientation, ironically. Now, to your point, we don't want to be held hostage to them. And so one of the things that Putin, so I'll probably give you a slightly different answer now, which is Putin's invasion of Ukraine has really woken up the world to supply chain security, the point you've asked about. So I think now what we can do is, you've heard of the Quad, so Japan, India, Australia and America are working on a little bit of a strategic alliance. It's more in name than in substance, but America is obviously doing a trade war with China. India's got a bit of an anti-China bias at the moment. They want to build their own manufacturing. We could help India develop modules competing with China. They can do it at a scale that probably can compete with China, whereas we can't. And therefore we could source our modules from India. Now, Tindo Solar is the only assembler of modules in Australia, and they'd probably take issue with me. They would love to be able to manufacture and supply Australian at the scale we need. But at the end of the day, yeah, I'm looking for a lot more scale. But coming back to energy security, supply chain security, where Australia can compete with the Chinese and we can do enormous value adding is we supply 46% of the world's lithium. Right? We produce and export 46% of the world's lithium. So we have a lithium boom globally that's going to be around for a decade or two or three or four. And Australia is already the number one player in the world. We do zero value adding of our lithium before we export it. So rather than competing with the Chinese where they've got a massive uncatchable advantage on us, why don't we actually value add our lithium? Why don't we value add our cobalt, our copper, our nickel, our our iron ore? Let's value add the resources where Australia is, like, we export 38% of the world's iron ore. We do zero value add of our iron ore before we export it. Now, we also have massive economies of scale in being able to produce renewable energy cheaper and a bigger scale than any other country in the world other than maybe China. So we could use renewable energy produced in Australia to decarbonize our resources before we export them. That would then help China, Japan, Korea, India decarbonize their economy because they decarbonize their supply chain. And Australia does things at a massive scale and helps decarbonize the world. So I'm all for the idea of leveraging Australia's economies of scale. I'm all for Australia value adding our exports and being competitive. Let's seize the opportunity. But part of why I also reference all of that, sorry, a very long answer to your question.
Yeah,
but
that's all right.
There are massive, massive jobs in regional Australia. There's massive, massive investments in regional Australia. There's massive export opportunities in value adding our resources before we export them. And so I see that as a sort of 10, 20, 30, 40 billion dollar a year export opportunity in regional Australia, high value adding and lots of jobs. And so that is sort of how the Albanese government can get more spine to go harder and more aggressive. If they can see tens of billions of dollars of annual export revenues, huge investment, huge employment, then they can actually stare down the coal lobby a little more. But we need those facilities. Now, I'll finish by saying there are 10 value-added refineries in development in Australia for our critical forward-facing minerals right now. And so I'm going to do an op-ed on that in the next couple of weeks, just highlighting, I'm not talking a pipe dream, I'm not talking next decade, I'm actually talking about investments happening right now in 2022 in Australia, value-adding our resources.
Okay, thanks.
I think there's another question here. Is it from Marie or Mayor Sheehan? And I think you've probably answered her questions. Mayor, are you there?
Yep. Moira,
sorry.
That's all right.
Is there anything beyond what Tim has just said that you would like to ask?
Basically, it's about ensuring that we install enough to service the needs of our country, if you like. Looking at the domestic market and the domestic power. Yes, we have the capability, I understand, but are there systems and processes in place to do that? And one of the linked things is about the lithium and using that as a commercial product and exporting. Fine, that's the business end of it, but also prioritizing. That's my question really, is how do we prioritize our domestic use? Because we've been for decades and longer exporting a whole pile of stuff when actually we need it at home. Look at what's, and I'm not defending gas in any as a power source in any sense, but look what's happened with we used to own all our own gas, and then it got privatized and exported.
So you're talking about reservation policies in relation to lithium. Is that right?
Lithium, and also in terms of investing in solar farms. I mean, obviously, people who put it on their own houses, I mean, there might be subsidies, they put it on their own roofs, et cetera, et cetera. They might have batteries. There's a whole range of things that need to be done. And it's not happening at the scale where we can transition effectively. That's my perception of it.
Yep.
Moira, I think that it opens up. That's a very good question. I'll maybe just respond by saying we are doing it at a reasonably good scale. We need to step it up 2 or 3 or 4 times. But I'm just thinking, Darren Miller, the CEO of Arena, about 4 years ago made a comment. He doesn't want to aim for 100% renewables in Australia. He wants to aim for 700% renewables. And at the time, I thought it was, a little bit of a joke. I thought, hang on, we're at 20% at the time he said it. Now we're at 33%. Now, Mike Cannon-Brookes picked up on it and said, we could go for 500% renewables. And then I think our chief scientist, Dr. Alan Finkel, picked up on it and said, 700% renewables, that's quite doable in Australia. We are, as always, blessed as a country with natural resources. In this case, we've got one of the lowest population densities in the world. We've got a massive landmass, and we could actually have 700% renewables. And so that then allows you to use all that surplus renewable energy. You can't export electricity. Okay, now Mike Cannon-Brookes is trying with some cable to prove me wrong, but you can't export electricity today, and you won't be able to this decade, and I'm not sure you ever will from Australia. But what you can export is the electricity in the metals. So think of aluminium. Aluminium is really congealed electricity, and like 70, 80, 90% of the cost of processing bauxite into aluminium is the electricity cost. So if we do what Rio Tinto at Tomago has announced they would do back in November last year, they're going to 100% decarbonise their use of electricity at Tomago, north of Newcastle, and they're going to do it by 2029, sorry. So it's quite feasible that we'll be exporting renewable energy powered aluminium by the end of this decade and getting a trade advantage because we'll be exporting 100% green aluminium. So long answer, but again, Australia could build literally hundreds of gigawatts of renewables. We've got more land you can poke a stick at. Yep. Wind and solar does have environmental negatives, so I would very much agree with you. We want to do rooftop solar first. The AEMO integrated system plan actually forecasts Australia will have 68 gigawatts of rooftop solar by 2050. At the moment, we're about 13, 14 gigawatts. We're the highest in the world in absolute terms, by far the highest in the world per capita. And AEMO models that rooftop solar penetration is going to grow 4-fold in just the next 28 years. So there will be a hell of a lot more renewable energy in Australia. And I think Darren Miller called it right. For 500 or 700% renewables for Australia makes us a renewable energy superpower.
Thank you.
And the lithium reservation policy, is that something you would support?
Well, at the moment, again, we're blessed because people are now, because of Putin, worried about supply chain security. The Americans, the Japanese, the Indians, the Brits are all worried about being too reliant on China. as the previous question asked, I mean, it is absolutely, supply chain security is absolutely paramount in 2022. And so people are going, well, we want to diversify away from China. Where would you build a lithium refinery? Australia. We produce all the lithium. Why wouldn't you do it here? Where do you want rare earth refineries? Let's do it in Australia. So let's build a rare earth refinery. That's what we're doing right now. We produce more copper than almost any other country in the world. Why don't you do some copper smelting? Well, we do that. But what I want to do is have all of those industry smelters powered by renewable energy. And in fact, I'll give a hat tip to the Koreans. Sun Metals, Korea Zinc up in Townsville, has a zinc refinery, and they expect that zinc refinery to be 100% renewable powered by 2025. So it'll be the first green, 100% green zinc refinery in the world, and it's in Townsville in Australia. So we can do it. And value-adding lithium, are we going to be a battery manufacturer to the world? Probably not. Like, there's more battery plants being built in the world today than you can poke a stick at. Every week there's another world record. Like last week, CATL of China announced a $7 billion battery factory in Hungary, but they're building it close to where the EVs are being manufactured. Now, we're not going to be an EV manufacturer. We might do value add small niche trucks or whatever, but the idea we're going to be a mass market car manufacturer, well, we haven't been that for decades. So at the end of the day, batteries are a key part of EVs. Countries are worried about supply chain, so they want the battery manufacturing in Germany or in Europe to supply Europe. They want it in America to supply America. Biden's actually, his Inflation Reduction Act requires EVs in America, if they're going to get the $4,000 concession tax deduction, they've got to use American-made batteries. So, okay, they can use an American-made battery using Australian value-added lithium. So I'd say let's start with what we're really good at, what we are world competitive at. That's mining. Okay, let's value add our mining before we export it.
Right. Look, I'll just go back to a question which is focusing on the next few years. Robin, are you there? She's gone.
No, I'm here.
Would you like to read the next question? The question that you wrote about the effect of
well, how life changes really quickly. That our government went into their election with promises around electricity prices, but the war in Ukraine has a real impact on the fossil fuel industry. So my question is to you, Tim, is will circumstances like that lead to a slowdown in renewable energy, the transition to renewable energy here in overseas? Because
we've got a global crisis, an energy crisis, but you can't have the cost of coal go up 800%, the cost of gas go up 800%. European electricity prices have gone up tenfold, from 50 euros to 500 euros they hit this week, without massive demand destruction and alternative cheaper sources being financed. So the good news is coal-fired power plants have never been more expensive to run. And in fact, Eraring, which Origin Energy just announced a couple of months ago, they're closing by 2025. They're closing it. It's end of life. It doesn't work. They don't want to invest in it, but they're closing it because they can't afford to buy coal. Like, the coal prices it's a statement of fact. They literally can't get coal except at export price parity, so they can't afford to run Eraring. So they actually offered to give it back to Matt Keane, the New South Wales Treasurer. He didn't want to take it because there are massive cleanup costs. So Origin's going to have to close it and clean it up. Now, okay, that's the state of the disruption that we're under. You can't have prices go up 800% without demand destruction and without funding alternatives. So I could build you a wind farm tomorrow at on your roof at $100 a megawatt hour. Well, the current price for wholesale electricity is $200 a megawatt hour. You can do solar in 1 year at $50 a megawatt hour. You can do wind at $50 or $60 a megawatt hour. You can do offshore wind at probably $100 a megawatt hour. So the idea that the electricity price in 2 years' time will be $200 where we are today, it can't be. It'll be below 100 again as soon as we flood the market with new renewables. But you can't do that on a 1 or 2 year view because the grid is not ready. And so the constraining factor on driving electricity prices back down is what the Albanese government's been talking quite aggressively about, a $20 billion grid investment program to actually build out the grid, modernise the grid, facilitate the grid in areas where renewable energy can be built best and fastest and biggest. And so all these renewable energy zones that the state governments have been working on need grid transmission capacity. So on a 5 year view, electricity prices will go back below $100 a megawatt hour. And on a 10 year view, they'll go back down below $50 a megawatt hour because that's the cost of building wind and solar, even with battery firming or pumped hydro firming. So short term, medium term, prices will stay high because we're not ready, because we had Angus Taylor, the numbnut, as our energy minister. He delivered energy policy chaos into the Australian market. He froze new investment capacity, and we'll all now pay the price of that. So we can thank Angus for leaving an energy chaos and extreme energy hyperinflation in the Australian market. If he'd got out of the way and allowed renewables to be built, we wouldn't have the energy problems we have today.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Could I just ask you, Tim, this is just from me. I was really surprised to see that Germany was so hooked on Russian gas and was so ill prepared for what's happened in Ukraine. Were you surprised about that?
Yeah, it's an absolute travesty. It's clearly a failure of policy. They've really underestimated the importance of energy security. And Germany's led the world, and I've been a huge fan of what Angela Merkel's done, but in terms of driving technology and investment in decarbonisation and subsidising, using German balance sheet and taxpayers to actually fund the transition to get it where we could then take off. But yeah, there was a massive flaw in Germany's strategy. They were doing appeasement of Russia. They were trying to actually integrate the Russian economy into the German economy, into the European economy, thinking that Russia would never play the games it's going to play if they're self-reliant on each other. Then if they're exporting, if they're profiteering from each other, then they're not going to destroy each other. And it's totally failed. But I think what will come out, and I think it's already started to come out, the Russian fossil fuel companies were bribing German politicians to the tune, I've heard a number of 100 million euros a year going into German politicians' pockets, in effectively just straight out bribes to the German government. Like the Chancellor, I'll probably get the name wrong, so I won't defame him. But yeah, the amount of money going into German politics from the Russian Gazprom, for example, was obscene. It was just absolute failure of government. It shows why fossil fuels corrupt, whether it's in Australia or India, Indonesia or Germany or Russia. Where there's coal, there's corruption. Where there's gas, there's corruption. So, yeah, it was a total failure.
Yeah.
Sorry to intervene. We're running out of time here. We've still got a few questions to go. Yeah. So how much time have you got, Tim?
I'll try and be short for a change. I've failed so far on that.
Yeah, so we've got about 3 or maybe 4 questions, and I'd like to get through the questions that people have posed in the chat. We won't be able to get to any of the other ones, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, let's just push on quickly. Peter Curley is the next one on the list, and I think this is about population growth. I'm not sure, but Peter, could you...
Yep. Yeah. Now, what I wanted to do, just as a general oversight of what's been said, is our populations are increasing quite dramatically, and we'll do so to 2060. And its standards of living as they increase, individual, in other words, energy use per person increases. So what interests me here is that in doing this transition now to renewable, which is excellent, but the question I put is, how is that actually being facilitated by the fact that there's an expanding need for energy full stop, right? And secondly, the comfort that when you do have manufacturing equipment that you no longer need, you can put it in a museum or something, but it's actually very hard and expensive to get rid of it. So my question for you, as a philosophical question, if population did not increase and, I'd like standard of living to increase, but energy use to have been more efficient. But the question is, if there was not that growth that's still going on, how effective would your policies be? And that particularly from a business or financial point of view. I hope that's not too hard.
Yeah, I mean, it's more an economics and a philosophical question, but at the end of the day, from my perspective, we need more sustainable living and regulatory framework. So, for example, we are all advocating for solar, but has the federal government or has any state government got a good recycling program for solar? The answer is okay, but we've only just installed. We need to actually have the right framework. Now, there's some development on that, and a solar module will last for 20 years, but we actually need the recycling programs in now. If we're all going to have electric vehicles, there's going to be a huge amount of batteries. We need to have recycling of batteries compulsory. We need 100% recycling. GE has just introduced a recyclable wind turbine because turbines are the stuff you make surfboards out of. It's a non-recyclable product. It's landfill. You can't have landfill. We've got to have a more sustainable economy. But going back to energy, at the end of the day, every house in Australia, if we had a 7, 8, 9-star rated house rather than the 3-star rated houses we have, in other words, we have insulation, if we had double glazing, if we had rooftop solar, if we had storage, if we had induction cooking, all the sort of things that Dr. Saul Griffiths talked about, and we had huge amounts of solar on our roof, well, those houses will be net exporters of energy. Now, once you put solar on your roof and you're a net exporter, you can be profligate with your use of electricity because you're actually generating it from the sun, so long as the modules are recycled, so long as the batteries are recycled. So we need a more sustainable economic model than we've got now. But population per se in Australia is not a problem. It's having the right recycling and having a more sustainable economic framework. But yes, I think Richard Dennis at the Australia Institute's written enormously about how we've got such a consumerist economic framework. It's just wrong. But that's a different question. But at the end of the day, we can be profligate if you're using wind and solar because it's free, it's renewable, but so long as you recycle as well.
Thanks, Tim. I'm just going to jump in and ask my 2 questions, then James can ask the last one. So my 2 are, can we get to net zero emissions without a carbon tax or an ETS? And the second one, how soon will our trading partners stop buying our coal?
Yeah, it would be so much easier if we had a carbon price. And the reality is we probably will have a carbon price, and we already have one in development. It's called the ACCU, the Australian Carbon Credit Unit. Now, Angus Taylor did his best to destroy it in his incompetence, and I won't defame him anymore because, the guy's just done an enormous damage to Australia. But the ACCU is a price on carbon, and it's trading at $29 a tonne Australian at the moment. Now, the European price is 80 euros, which is about 150 Aussie dollars a tonne. So the bigger the carbon price, the easier it is to decarbonise industry, decarbonise transport, decarbonise power, and so on. So I think, I'm obviously finance, you price in the externality and the financial markets can solve it tomorrow. The reality is I mentioned the Global Finance Alliance for Net Zero Emissions, when 130 trillion of capital is pledged to 1.5 degrees, when almost every Australian company has pledged to net zero by 2050, they're going to do it. And the safeguard mechanism leverages the ACCU, it leverages effectively a quasi price on carbon. So we're actually going to get there actually in the next 12 months to a large degree. Whether we do it a bit more explicitly, I would say would be the logical thing to do. But unfortunately, Abbott made the carbon tax so politically toxic, it might take a second term of the Albanese government before we get one. But can you do it without it? Yes. Is it going to be more expensive? Yes. Is it harder? Yes. Why would you make it harder? We want to do this fast and quickly. But at the end of the day, China will have a carbon price. At the moment, it's about $8. It needs to double and double again. When China's got it, our trade partners will start to actually, Japan has to have a carbon price for Japan to deliver on its carbon trajectory that it's pledged to. And they don't have a carbon price at the moment. So when our trading partners have one, we'll get one by default because we're an export-driven country.
And when our partners are going to stop buying our coal, how soon is that going to happen?
Yeah, I still think it's going to happen pretty quickly. And why do I say that? I mean, coal at $400 a tonne, the Indians, the Chinese, the Japanese can't afford to have it. I mean, in China this week, they've actually just announced they're closing a whole lot of industry down for 3 or 4 hours a day because they have an electricity crisis. They can't afford to run their factories on coal. It's too expensive at the moment. So at the end of the day, wind and solar is cheaper than thermal coal. We've got hybrid in Sweden, which is producing coking coal-free virgin steel. Recycling of scrap steel in America is taking off. And at the end of the day, coking coal is threatened because there are alternatives. How long will it take? 20 years? But you go from where we are today to zero on a 20-year trajectory, that's actually going to impact very quickly, in my view. Mm-hmm. And it won't happen overnight, but it's the bullshit you hear about, oh, we can't stop using coal tomorrow. No one really talks about stopping using it tomorrow. We need to invest in solutions first and replacement solutions. Now, the coal price going up will drive investment in replacement solutions, and it'll drive it at a speed no one was expecting even a year ago.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's great. James, do you want to ask your last question?
James has disappeared.
He's disappeared. Okay, well, I'll ask it for him.
Oh, I'm here. I'm here.
Okay, no worries.
Yeah, so hi, Tim. So my question is, how do we deal with Murdoch? How do we deal with the climate denial and attack on renewable energy? What can we do to push back?
Yeah, it's an absolutely key thing. I mean, at the end of the day, I love working with some of the teals because their platform is all about integrity in government. It's about climate change, and it's about transparency and honesty in government. And at the end of the day, we also need donation reform, but we, as you point out, we need free media. Now, to some degree, it's happening anyway. I mean, the growth of The Guardian, and hopefully now the ALP's back in, they'll refund the ABC, but the alternate media is actually growing. But you're right, Murdoch is a toxic cancer in our democracy. Yeah, and I don't have any particular solution to it other than we should have a rule that only Australians can own Australian press, and we need diversity of press. And yeah, so I agree with you 100%. I don't have a clear solution other than to keep calling them out and just watch the continued decline of the readership of The Australian and cheer every time it happens.
Sorry, there is one more question from Kyle. Go ahead, Kyle.
Hey, I'm just wondering what can be done on more of a local and state level to speed up the transition and the pace of that renewable energy transition?
Kyle, that's a good question. In fact, for the last couple of years, the states have actually been leading because Angus Taylor's been such a dead weight on anything to do with climate change. So the states have taken a lead, and I won't give Matt Keane a shout out, but there was probably one of the most exciting announcements in Australia this year was, in fact, a renewable energy tender for the Hunter Valley that Matt Keane announced. He called for expressions of interest in the Hunter Valley Renewable Energy Zone in February or March of this year. So in other words, when Angus Taylor was still the bunny in charge, trying to stop investment, and investors put forward $100 billion expressions of interest for new firm to renewable investment in the Hunter Valley alone. So we've all heard, oh, the coal miners and the coal industries are a dead weight on decarbonisation in Australia. The Hunter Valley coal workers know the end is coming, and they just want to see their communities actually looked after and see the transition work. Well, $100 billion of investment in the Hunter Valley, even if a tenth of that goes ahead, which Matt Keane's proposing 5 different renewable energy zones across New South Wales. And if each of them's $10 billion of investment, that's a huge amount of new jobs, new investment in regional Australia. And so the states are doing their work. Now, Lily D'Ambrosio is doing the same thing down in Victoria. Mick de Brenny's doing the same thing up in Queensland, because they're all competing. They don't want New South Wales doesn't want to be importing wind and solar from Queensland. They want it in our state. So the states have actually made really good progress on renewable energy zones. And it comes back to the point I made earlier. The big constraining factor is actually interstate grid transmission, because the best way you firm renewables is geographic diversity. And when it's windy in South Australia, it's not windy in Queensland. Now, with solar, when it's sunny in New South Wales, it's sunny in Queensland. But South Australia is an hour behind, so they get an hour extra solar at night, which, if you have the grid transmission from South Australia to New South Wales, which we're looking to build, that will help. So geographic diversity will help, but the states are doing a lot. Councils are leading as well. So yeah, it takes all 3 levels of government to drive this.
They're not.
Well, thanks very much for that question, Kyle. And thanks very much for your presentation. It's been absolutely fantastic, Tim. Every time we hear you, we come back wanting more. And so I hope at some stage down the track, you'll grace us with your presence again.
Thank you. Sorry for the going a bit over time and my enthusiasm on answering some of those questions. Great to see you all again.
Our absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks.
Thanks, Billy. Thanks, Kim.